Hey everyone, it's Mr. Murphy. I'm going to do a quick run through the process of cell respiration and the three parts of it. This will be similar to what we saw in photosynthesis, but we'll do it a little bit more quickly. You guys have handled everything super well so far. Before we get into the specific parts, though, I do want to point out that throughout this, it should start to become really apparent to you that the process of cell respiration is almost exactly the opposite of photosynthesis. Not just in terms of like the reactants and the products being flipped, but the actual chemical nature of what's going on. In the process of photosynthesis, plants are taking energy from the sun to create food. They're storing that energy as food. And the process of cell respiration is taking that food and breaking it down to release that energy again. So it literally is just undoing the process of photosynthesis. That's not bad, because the whole point of photosynthesis is store energy as food. So that way, when you need that food, cell respiration jumps in and can release that energy. So when we look at this, there are three phases: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or sometimes called the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. The three of these are very similar to the light-dependent and light-independent reactions of photosynthesis in that they all rely upon each other for various chemicals and molecules being passed around. And if one shuts down, it definitely has an effect on the others, as we'll see. So the first part of this is glycolysis. And I don't need you to know, all of these reactions of glycolysis, but I want you to appreciate the fact that that's what's happening. We're taking glucose, that food molecule, and we're starting to break it down. You notice right away at the beginning, it actually requires a little bit of energy to do this. This is not unlike how in order to light a candle, you need to use a match, right? You need to put that initial energy in, but then you're going to get a lot more energy out from the burning of the candle. Similarly here, glucose is a pretty stable molecule, so you have to put some energy in order to sort of get it to want to break apart. But in the end of this, we're actually going to get a lot more energy out. So in the process of glycolysis, glucose gets broken down into two of these G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Name doesn't matter unless you're super into chemistry. Two of these G3P molecules, and these G3P molecules are then going to be changed and broken down a little bit into something called pyruvate. You don't need to memorize the names of these things, but one thing I want to point out is we put 2 ATP in, but each of those 2 G3Ps is going to generate 2 ATP, which means you're going to generate a total of 4 ATP. So it cost us 2, but we got 4 out, which means that glycolysis is going to give us plus 2 ATP. And that's important because the first phase right away is going to give us 2 ATP for every glucose that we break down. I also want to point out that this molecule here, G3P, if you remember from the Calvin cycle or the light-independent reactions with photosynthesis, that's the little 3-carbon molecule that came out and became glucose. So right away we can see that cell respiration is just undoing the process of photosynthesis. On the next section, we have the citric acid cycle, and what happens is that pyruvate that we were making over there has now become acetyl-CoA. Doesn't matter again, but the point is that that's being passed into the citric acid cycle, and it's going to go through another process where every single one of these arrows is really representing one or more chemical reactions happening, and each time we're just sort of changing around the shape of these carbons and hydrogens and oxygens in order to get this molecule into a situation where we can mooch some of the energy of those chemical bonds. And that's where we're generating our chemical energy carriers. In this case, we see they're called NADH right here and FADH2. Now, these two things are energy carriers just like the ATP and the NADPH that we created in photosynthesis. It's also worth noticing that we also do make some ATP. Now it's labeled as GTP, but as it says here, it's essentially equivalent to ATP. So the citric acid cycle also generates 2 ATP per glucose molecule, because one glucose becomes 2 pyruvates, so you're going to get 2 ATP right away. We're also making these other energy carriers though, a whole bunch of NADHs and an FADH2. Then we come to the electron transport chain. And again, I can't stress enough, this should remind you of the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. It's the exact same process where, just in reverse, where during photosynthesis we had an excited electron from the light, and that excited electron caused things like NADPH and ATP to be formed. Here we're using the energy of NADH, FADH2, our energy carriers, to excite an electron. So we're really putting it in reverse. And that excited electron, similar to photosynthesis, pumps some hydrogens across the membrane. And then, because you have so many hydrogens here in this space inside of the mitochondrial wall, what happens is that that hydrogen wants to move out, and we see the exact same the exact same protein, ATP synthase, that's there and ready to let those hydrogens move through and mooch some of their energy, just like they did in photosynthesis. And in that process, it produces ATP, and it actually makes somewhere around 34 ATP in the process of the electron transport chain. So we saw 2 ATP during glycolysis, 2 ATP during the Krebs cycle, and here we make about 34 ATP. Now, we don't have a good sense. You don't have a good sense. I don't even have a good sense of like how much energy are we talking about in a single ATP. A single ATP molecule is not going to allow much to happen inside of the cell, but the point is that one glucose molecule can become somewhere around 38 ATP, and the overwhelming majority of that happens in the electron transport chain. One last thing to notice, just like we did with photosynthesis, if we have these electrons being dropped off here, those electrons need to go somewhere, right? You can't just pile up electrons. It'd become super negative. It would all sort of shut down. There'd be nowhere for them to go. And the place that the electrons go is that they join up with oxygen gas. And that oxygen gas scoops up those electrons, and it scoops up a couple hydrogens that are getting pumped across this membrane, and it becomes water. The reason why I point this out as like a really important thing is if you've ever stopped to think, why do I have to breathe? Why can't I go more than a few minutes without it being a problem that I'm not breathing? And the answer is right here. This is where the oxygen goes. When you breathe in, and that oxygen goes into your lungs and goes into your bloodstream and goes to all of your cells, it's powering this process. This is actually the only reason we need oxygen, is to be an electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, which is part of cell respiration. That's a mouthful for explaining why do we need to breathe, but it's kind of cool to see, you know, as like an answer to a question that maybe you've had or maybe you haven't, but I think it's a question worth asking. You know, we breathe because we need that oxygen to help the process of the electron transport chain. As you can imagine, when you're running in a race or if you're holding your breath for too long, the reason why, you know, oxygen supply becomes an issue is because if you're running, your muscles are generating tons of ATP, but when you're not getting enough oxygen, they're unable to make enough ATP, and that's where you start getting that muscle fatigue, or you get like the little side sticker things, and you know, you start feeling sort of that oxygen deficit inside of your muscles, and you start feeling that pain of you know, I'm pushing myself too hard and I can't keep going, and that has a lot to do with how your body's its ability to get the oxygen where it needs to go. Okay, whew, that's a lot, I know, all at once. The point is, I don't need you to know the nitty-gritty chemistry, but I want you to understand how it is a step-by-step process that's handing off these different molecules, so that when you look at a diagram like this one and you see just the big picture of cell respiration, you can understand how these three different processes are working together for the end result, which is produce energy for the cell. So what's happening here is a quick overview. We have glucose, which is our food, being broken down in glycolysis, the products of that being passed on to the Krebs cycle, the products of that being passed on to the electron transport chain, which then uses oxygen in order to release all of that energy as the chemical ATP, which is the go-to chemical storage of energy inside of the cell. And that energy could go to helping to produce new DNA, or helping cells divide, or helping move things around, bring things into the cell, send things out of the cell. Any of the stuff that our cells are doing, the ATP is the energy source for that. So that's the process of cell respiration. I hope that we can see the connections with photosynthesis. We'll be focusing more on that in our next lesson. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know. Thanks.